All right, well, I welcome all of you. I am hopeful that BB Coker will join us shortly. I had also invited Reverend Lloyd Casson, Canon Lloyd Casson of St. Andrew and Matthew. And I would have invited former Mayor Jim Baker, but BB advises that he wouldn't touch a computer with a 10-foot pole. So that being said, we will hear tonight from BB and Lloyd and Jim. We're going to watch a 28-minute video that was put together by WHYY in 2018 that marked the 50th anniversary of the events. And then we'll have a conversation. When John Hickey of Westminster heard we were having the program, he lent me his newspaper. It's a copy of the Morning News from April 10th, 1968, and the headline reads, 3,500 guardsmen sent to city area. Massive fires mark disorder. Curfew remains today upstate. Entire Delaware Guard called out. Negro youth shouts its anger. So it's capture of a moment in time, and we will hear a great deal more, both about what led up to it, what went on, and the ensuing events and the challenges that we still face. So let's get started. She said, let me try again.
Welcome to this WHYY special. I'm Nichelle Polston. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the assassination of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King's murder caused shockwaves throughout the country, especially in the Black community. From city to city, African Americans took to the streets to express their deep-rooted anger and frustration. Wilmington was among those cities that saw neighborhoods ravaged by riots. In tonight's special, the Wilmington Siege moving forward 50 years later, we talk with local leaders about the riots and their hopes for the future of Delaware's largest city.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He has allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as people will get to the promised land. So I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort.
News of King's assassination rocketed across America. Long simmering anger and frustration exploded in riots, looting, and fires in more than 120 cities. Among those cities, Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and Wilmington, Delaware. The National Guard was called in to douse the flames and restore order.
Dr. King, when he was assassinated, our city was burned to the ground in some parts. I wondered then whether blacks and whites would ever talk to one another again.
On April 8, 1968, following a memorial service honoring the civil rights leader who had always advocated nonviolence, the simmering tensions erupted on the streets of Wilmington.
The commemorative services went off without an incident. It was after the services that a couple of gangs decided to needle each other and they started the ruckus.
The word came down and people just started coming out in the streets and just started from there, just like bam, it just happened.
On the way home already, there was a building near where I lived, the Clover Dairy building. I don't remember exactly where it was, but it was burning that quick. And I remember thinking to myself, burn it down. This is me talking. Talk about rage. I was enraged. I had experienced President Kennedy's assassination, and under the circumstances of that assassination, felt that it was probably racist motivation and so on that brought down President Kennedy, just as he was about to emerge. And I felt that his assassination was an abomination. And I thought it was people who just wanted to end that kind of progressive movement. So when Dr. King was assassinated, I felt, the forces of evil are really winning here.
You could see smoke starting in the afternoon coming from Westminster City, and that was the first shocker because you knew something was going on. And then I went over there and it was in Westminster City, and it was really funny because I started walking down Madison Street and there was no people around at all. And as I got closer, the smoke got heavier as I got closer to in terms of 7th Street, just about 7th Street. And there was a young police officer on the corner, and he was standing there, and I didn't pay him any mind. He said, "Sir, can I ask you, why are you here?" I said, "I saw the smoke, and I used to live over here, and I just wondered what was going on." And he says, "Well, we got a lot of problems right now, and I don't think you should be here." So I didn't argue with him. I just turned around and laughed. And of course, as night went on, it just got worse.
That particular day or that particular riot time is sort of etched because it wasn't just that day. That wasn't. This thing has been building up for a long time. And it wasn't just about Martin Luther King. That was huge in terms of, say, being an impetus that sparked it. But the whole business of distrust and dissatisfaction and restlessness and what do we do? It had been building up for a long time. We had been working on things like open housing laws, trying to help people to understand. Wouldn't have to worry about desegregating schools if we had open housing laws. So you're looking at a dissatisfaction with education. You're looking at, I can't remember what the unemployment rates were. You're looking at years of unwritten laws about who lives where. You're looking at people that did not do a lot of protesting. You can look in the newspaper and check the history. There wasn't a lot of that here in Wilmington. There were so many restrictions around what Black people could do and where you could go. I mean, why not? They had nothing to lose.
But behind it all were all the things that were happening in Wilmington and not happening in Wilmington. No jobs, unemployment, particularly among Black people, and especially Black men, was really terrible, terrible. Education, inadequate health care. home, segregated housing and poor housing. It was really, this was not a good situation back in the 60s. And so the people who were rioting were really expressing their rage.
I was a youth worker with the United Way, and or it was called WHYY at the time. They were sponsoring it, and we were trying to get the youth to calm down because there wasn't any win in this. See, for me, if you're going to go to war, make sure the other guy suffers, not you or your family. Why are you doing that? It's sort of like the same problem we have today with the guns and the young men. Why are you doing it? It don't make any sense. But anyway, they were in no mood to listen to anybody at that time. And all the youth workers tried to get together, and then we tried to go in and do it in teams. And still, the young people were just too violently upset about the assassination. And basically, all of this, the unemployment, all these other things contributed to that. It just, King's assassination just was the spark that blew it up. And these young people never saw themselves as rioters. They said they're freedom fighters. And I agree with them.
We went downtown, and I remember it was 9th and Market. And by the time we got up there, I think the bank, Wilmington Trust, was on that corner. And I can't remember who was with me, but I remember when I got there on that sidewalk on the left-hand side of the street, Jim saw us, Baker. And because all of us were friends and we all worked together in various, for various protesting causes. And he said, don't go any further because they're going to lock everybody into the middle of the block there. Because the mounted police were, it was either 9th or 10th, were coming, blocking off that way. And I remember 4th Street down that way. And of course, everybody coming in the center of the city with all the stores that we used to have there, Leroy's, Mullins, all that kind of stuff. They were right there, right? Everybody came up from what we call the valley. They were coming up to protest everything that anybody could think of.
The 60 riots, especially 68 above all, because Detroit looked like the whole city was going to burn down, actually. I think that was the biggest thing, was the economic loss to us, because we lost economically in every city that you had those riots.
As day turned into night in Wilmington on April 8th, the rage on the streets intensified. The center of the fury was West Center City, known as the Valley.
In terms of the fires and people getting arrested, people doing all kinds of things, and the police tried to cordon West Center City off. And the young kids that I was talking to, trying to get them to settle down, they didn't want to hear it. So I kept telling them, you're not going to get out of here. They've got the whole place cordoned off. We're going to go downtown. We're not going to tear up our neighborhoods. Well, they didn't get very far. They got to Washington Street, and that was it. The police just... And then we had 400 people arrested, during that whole period of time. So the devastation by the fires really was bad. Because here was a place that people lived in these houses. And you had more homeowners living in West Center City at that time than you do today. Today, it's just a rental community. It's not a home ownership community. But you had houses that just businesses. You had a bank on Madison Street. You had a furniture store on Madison Street. You had restaurants on Madison Street. By the time it's all done, all of that evaporated.
I did find myself among other Black leaders in the community, really being highly present, especially in the West Center City, where most of the unrest was expressed, right out in what was called the Valley in those days. I think it was given to them by the press. That's where a lot of the unrest was, snipering, but mostly looting, more looting than anything.
When the smoke settled after the first night of unrest, 14 people had been injured, with 5 suffering gunshot wounds. Police made 54 arrests. There were 8 reports of snipers and 14 incidents of looting. But restoring peace around the clock proved to be a major drain on Wilmington's police department. So Mayor John Babiars asked Governor Charles Terry for backup.
They had things pretty well under control. It wasn't escalating, but they were tired and they needed some help just to take their places overnight. And as I said, the governor reacted. He mobilized the entire guard.
I still remember Monday morning seeing National Guard troops coming into the city, deuce and a half trucks, and it was almost unbelievable. It was unbelievable.
I saw these people in Jeeps, just like in Berlin, Israel, Egypt, wherever else. They were in these Jeeps, and there would be somebody driving, somebody sitting on the passenger side, and 2 soldiers with guns, bayonets, sitting in the back, coming by my house every day.
You didn't want to be out on the street when they were out of those vehicles. Because I remember being stopped. and I said to myself, I said, you know, this is really dangerous because these guys aren't even holding their weapons right. They're not holding it up away from you. They're pointing them. They shouldn't be pointing unless you did something. And everybody thought it was going to be short term, like they're going to be for a while and then they're going to be gone. But then it just kept going on and on.
I was telling a story the other night. They used to take people down when they arrested them. At the time, the National Guard was on the streets. We're the only city in American history ever to be occupied by the military since the Civil War. And so they would take people temporary hold down to the Wilmington train station.
In addition to around-the-clock police and guard patrol, an 8 p.m. curfew was also ordered. Community leaders like Baker and Kaysen, who assisted with keeping the peace, were issued cards allowing them to be out past curfew.
I still have it. It was signed by John Connor because the curfew was a county curfew, county-wide curfew. So I had this green card, imagine that. It was sort of like being in apartheid South Africa. It actually said the undersigned and 2 others in his party or something like that is authorized to be on the streets after curfew. There was a real curfew, There were lots of different kinds of curfews. There were unwritten ones that the police responded to. If you see more than 2 or 3 gathered in one place, you got to break it up. It was not cool.
That curfew was, you put stuff in place and you target a certain group, and that's the group that was targeted. You were going to rest assured that those younger people that were from the valley areas, we used to call it, on the west side, that they don't come up and protest.
The one time I was out past the curfew, that's when I got stopped by the National Guardsmen, and we had to do this on the wall and all that other kind of stuff. But and they're searching you. The card got me home, but I said I'm not going to do that anymore because I don't know what these guys are going to do, and the way they're handling their weapons, I don't trust them. And one kid did get killed by the National Guard, and it was called an accident. I'm not sure how that was done, but if they were handling the weapon the way they were when I was being stopped, there's no reason to believe that all you need to do is get excited and touch that trigger and it's all over.
With the situation on the streets of Wilmington quieting down, many thought it was time for the guard to go.
The mayor, Babiars, after 3 or 4 days, maybe a week, declared that the crisis was over and asked the governor to remove the troops. The governor, much like Trump, playing to his base, said, "Oh no, I'm not going to pull them out of here until I know that everything is safe, our businesses are safe, or blah 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 blah." It was just awful. So there was fear. There were people who were afraid, black people as well as white, who were afraid, just afraid. In other words, he knew what he was doing. by whipping up this fear, and keeping this guard presence here.
That patrol is in there to protect every citizen and every citizen's property in that city. It's not a police patrol. It's a patrol to keep crowds from assembling that would result in rioting.
I don't remember thinking, oh, we're safe now because they're here. Things were quieting down. That presence was for persons that I would say had great economic interest, business community in our town. For persons coming into town to go to work, particularly the larger DuPont. DuPont was all over downtown at that time. So there were tons of people that would come in town to work. There were reasons for that larger community, business community economically, to have the guard here. And that's why they were here. I mean, anybody that thinks that they were here to protect all citizens from any further riots, that's dumb. No, they were here to protect the interests of the business community in Wilmington, downtown, and the periphery.
I remember people in this church who were afraid to come to church. They didn't all live around here. They, lived out farther in Wilmington and suburbs. They were actually afraid. They didn't have anything to be afraid of, not at all. But the climate that was established by all this was just awful. And of course, it kept the rage going in our breasts.
We've had here in the office at least 3,000 or 3,500 letters, telegrams, begging us to keep them on the street.
I got a call from the governor's office, and they were talking about why is this and that, the other. And what I found out was that he was getting information from certain African Americans that were telling him that there was this armed group of African American youth who were going to pounce on the city the minute the guard was removed. So the governor trusted them and left them on the street. I mean, everybody thinks he was just being racist or hard-headed or whatever. No, they were telling him bad stuff that wasn't even true. I mean, they caught 6 guys on Cherry Island gun practicing, 6 African-American guys. They probably shouldn't have been doing it, but that's what they were doing. And from that, there's this big article. This Black Army was ready to seize the city.
I went to the Mayor John Babiarz, who was the mayor at the time, and others, and formed with them something called the Biracial Coordinating Committee. Right in the midst of all this going on, we met all the time during the occupation. We met to talk about what's really going on here. Never mind what Governor Terry is saying about criminals, all that sort of thing, and keeping the guard on the street. We know about all of that stuff. But we knew that, first of all, we had to work together to get the guard off the street because they were more problematic. They weren't really helpful.
It took an election and a changing of the guard before things would change for residents of Wilmington. Babiarz lost his bid for another mayoral term to Republican Harry Haskell. 9 months after the guard was deployed in Wilmington, they were demobilized. That order came from incoming Governor Russell Peterson, also a Republican. But the removal of the soldiers didn't mean the racial issues that sparked the unrest, housing, jobs, and poverty had been solved.
I don't know what's being done, but we are still addressing those issues. We're looking at rental properties, particularly for African Americans in the majority over ownership. You're looking at school dropout rates that are just absolutely enormous. You're looking at unemployment rates that are crazy. You're looking at incarceration that started back in the 60s that grew prisons around here like nobody's business. One of the first things that we need to do, not just as a state or a city or as a whole country, we need to acknowledge the fact that we have a problem and we have to identify what the problem is. You can't diagnose an illness if you've never physically examined the patient. We haven't identified the problem yet. And the problem, quite frankly, is institutionalized racism, whether we like it or not. It's not, and it's not always deliberate. People think that everybody understands this and that I know you because you're black, or you know me because I'm white, or whatever else. Everybody doesn't know everybody, and stop assuming that everything that happens here that has these racial overtones, that it's deliberate. People don't have to know you. Who are you? I know that the only way, to my way of thinking, the only way that we are ever going to get past all of this crappy institutionalized racism is to learn to talk to each other and to respect each other.
What has got to be renewed, I think, is the real, the jumelage, the relationships between the so-called power structure and the people in the community working together to solve, to find solutions to problems. Today, as I alluded earlier, what's most important, probably more important than anything, is to address that word of structural racism, which defines all of our public institutions. And it's a harder nut to crack without addressing that unknown or invisible white privilege that really defines, I hate to say this, but it does, it defines life. And we, by the way, African Americans, the people of color, have internalized that racism. And even though we don't necessarily believe it and articulate it, we internalize it. And it affects us physically, physiologically, and mentally, as well as how we see life and act on it ourselves. So there's a sickness in our society that has always been there. I applaud what the governor has done recently. And I know he was helped by the IMAC, the Black Clergy Association, which I'm not a practicing member of anymore. I'm not involved in any of those things, but I give them credit for the pressure that they and others applied that brought Governor Markell to sign ultimately legislation. And then Governor Carney has picked up on and begun to implement, making sure that there is a diversity officer, not just somewhere hidden off, but really up there in human relations where it belongs, to make sure that there is inclusion and working against racism and racist policies in the state government.
Not that there's been a lot of progress for African Americans, tremendous progress. So I'm not denying that. But you can't have a third of your population continuously in poverty and health. It's all gone. We are worse off in terms of pulling the people who were in poverty, are in poverty today, pulling them out of that status. We're worse off today than what we were in '68 because we can't pull anybody out. I think that we have great opportunities. We just have to put it together in a different fashion. The old 60 days are gone. The massive demonstrations and all the ways we did things then are no longer applicable. You have to come up with a new strategy as to how to deal with advancements, especially with the permanent poor, more so than worrying about, can you get into this college or can you get an appointment or a rise? We have to worry about these poor people that are stuck, that have no education, no skills, bad health, all the things that make it terrible. And as long as you don't deal with that, you're going to have the violence. You're going to have the terrible problems of people going into prisons, and you're going to have all the other. So we got to change the way we think and take care of us. I'm not worried about anybody else. You got to be selfish about that. America is the greatest place on the face of the earth. Why? Because it's the last hope of human race. If we can't solve race and we can't solve class and immigration and all that, it's not going to be, the world isn't going to be in a chaotic mess. And America has that opportunity to be the guiding light.
A half century after King's assassination, Black Americans have made great strides. Perhaps the greatest achievement was the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. But many of the challenges King fought to overcome remain: deep poverty, poor education, and rampant unemployment. And these words from King still ring true. Every man must decide whether he will walk in the light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. For WHYY, I'm Nichelle Poston. Thank you for watching.
Thoughts? Marge?
I think this was really wonderful. I don't know that I ever saw the PBS production of this, but it was good to see. We were not here in '68, but we were in DC. And as many of you will remember, the night that Martin Luther King got shot, half of DC burned. And we did tutoring once a week down at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. And at the end of the evening, the little boy that we were working with had no way home. And we weren't told anything. We were just told there was trouble in the city. So we said we would take him home. And he lived not too far from U Street, which was burning up. And we had no idea what we were getting into until we finally got him to his apartment and then back out. We lived in Virginia, back out to Virginia and turned the TV on. Until then, we had no idea what we had been in the middle of. But when we arrived in Wilmington in 1971, we went to a realtor. This was our first home. We had no idea about buying a house. We wanted to live in the city of Wilmington, and the realtor wouldn't sell us a house. They said, no, you don't want to live there. And we were like, well, yeah, we do, but no, you don't want to buy it. All left over from the '68 riots.
The legacy of what happened is so pervasive. And for many of us, we didn't understand the role that this has played in where we are and why we are. I read a piece that said that the prevailing disregard for Black life, legal system failures, trauma, hyper-policing, played a role in nearly every Black-led uprising in the 20th century. And so what happened in Wilmington was an extension of what happened elsewhere. But rather than hearing the grievances and the grief of Black citizens after they were pushed past their breaking point, the state sealed off those citizens even further and policed them even more intensely. The picture of the little girl behind the guardsman, 9 months. BB talked about the Jeeps with armed officers driving by her house every day. It difficult to comprehend.
We were living in Hockessin at the time. Don went into work every day into Wilmington. And BB's comment about the reason that the guard was kept there so long was not for the people, but to protect the businesses. It kind of struck me as interesting. I had not really thought about it that way until I heard that comment from BB. But for me, it was, I was a young mother taking care of 2 children and not really involved in politics at that point at all. But as in any riot, it's hard for me to understand when something like that happens, why the rioters attack their own owners of the businesses of their own race. So the rioters just were indiscriminate in destroying the businesses. And I think that's true from what I've read from other riots, that, the rage is just out there. They're just going to destroy whatever's in the path. And so that Black businesses were attacked the same as white-owned businesses were attacked. But I do remember not understanding why the guard was kept there so long.
It wasn't covered in the video, but a month later, the governor expanded the occupation by the guard to include Delaware State College in Dover, 50 miles from Wilmington. There was a nonviolent student protest on the campus, and he sent the guard, closed the campus entirely, canceled final exams, and kept the guardsmen on patrol at Delaware State.
Imagine what that did to college age kids.
I mean, a piece of what the issue is that here are people who have no agency. They have no power. They have no ability.
No weapons.
To enact any form of change. They are at the mercy of a system that has them in a box and no way to get out. The population, the Black population of Wilmington back in 1968 was 40%. 40% of Wilmington residents were Black. Unemployment rates were astronomical because all of the businesses moved when the suburban construction began in the 1950s after World War II. And so housing moved and businesses followed. And so there you are. And what are you to do? So to your point, Marlis, it's almost like you have nothing to lose. And it isn't that you're thinking that you're destroying a business that belongs to another Black person. You are just enraged at the circumstance and the situation, and you act out wherever you are. wherever you can. It's not a rational thought process. It is rage over complete impossibility. What else are you going, what else, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? How is it going to get better? And to have that 8 o'clock curfew, to have armed guards riding up and down your street every single day. One of the National Guardsmen shot an African-American man near the end of April. He was 35-year-old Douglas Henry, who died 4 hours after the guardsman shot him, and the guardsman wasn't charged. As Jim Baker said, some of the guardsmen didn't know how to hold a rifle, didn't know what they were doing. Those young men that were arrested on Cherry Island Marsh, they were part of the Wilmington Youth Emergency Action Council. It was an organization, and they were carrying out their regular target practice. They had been doing it for years at Cherry Island Marsh. But under these circumstances, they were arrested for using firearms within city limits and incarcerated.
Remember the feeling that it was like, it's kind of almost like currently our understanding of a war in Ukraine. I mean, it was, I think we were removed, we were isolated, and life went on as normal as soon as you got out of the city limits, which again, just shows the polarization of the two communities and the two races.
Well, we don't have to suffer what poor people suffer when they don't live close to us, when we are so separated and so segregated, especially then with the news. That wouldn't have been our experience. And the movement of jobs and the movement of housing, who did that? Again, white businesses. I'm sorry, but I can't believe that the governor, I don't know where DuPont was at the time in this history, but I cannot believe that city corporate structures were not the first ones to say, you need to get control over those people at all costs. And how many white universities have you called National Guards on for peaceful protest? It's a violation of other people's civil rights, is what it is.
And I will tell you that I returned from California in 1969, September of 69. So barely 9 months after the occupation ended. And I got a job at DuPont in downtown Wilmington. It was the Farmers Bank building at the time, next to the DuPont building. And I didn't know anything about the occupation. I didn't know anything about the patrols that had occurred. Life seemed perfectly normal in that bubble of the city. DuPont building, Nemours building, Farmers Bank building, Rodney Square. I can't believe that. And so there was a whole business structure, a whole white community that had forgotten the whole thing, as though it hadn't even happened. And yet, the Black people in the city were continuing to suffer the consequences of what occurred. And to your point, Marlis, imagine people coming to the area wanting to buy a house in Wilmington and being told, no, you don't. As Jim Baker said, that West Center City area was largely home ownership, Black home ownership when this started. And today, you'd be hard pressed to find a homeowner in that neighborhood. So the consequences are enormous, and they operate under the white radar. We just don't know, don't care. When you talk about white privilege, this is a prime example. We don't have to know. Not necessary. It's a reality for an inordinate number of people, and it is invisible to us.
Well, we didn't have to know until desegregation. Then we had to know.
Exactly. And it's like Bibi said early in the discussion, they were working on housing accessibility, a whole range of things that would seek to overcome the consequences of Jim Crow and redlining, and trying to build integrated housing communities so that desegregation wouldn't be a thing. If you're living in the same neighborhood, you're going to your neighborhood school. There's no busing. There's no desegregation. You live in an integrated neighborhood, and the schools mirror the complexion of the community, and all that stuff that had to happen to try to create an educational environment that would somehow counter the residential segregation led to catastrophe that we have in the education system today.
Schools are more segregated than ever. The poverty and the scarcity and the lack of resources in those schools, I don't understand it. But it's so deep. And what has changed? Absolutely nothing. I'm sure that the percentages of Black people living in poverty today is high, and unemployment is high. Education used to be the way to get out. We don't have that. Our kids get stuck with SRO policing, getting put into detention, going through those courts for teenagers and being put in different places. I mean, it's unfortunately still the route to incarceration, just starting at an earlier age. But we don't have enough mental health. We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough psychologists in the schools. So what has changed? We know what the problems are. We're willing to speak about them, but.
Well, it's interesting. It's one of the points that Bibi makes. I'm sorry she's not here to make it in person, but I think she did say in the video, before you're going to diagnose or cure a disease, you have to identify it and talk about it. And we don't. we talk about the symptoms, we talk about the periphery. And as Westminster Presbyterian Church, we say we are a Matthew 25 congregation. And one of the three pillars of being a Matthew 25 congregation is dismantling structural racism. And I think we have to ask, what does that mean? What does that call us to do? It's obviously not a project, not an event, but to share some dialogue about what it is and how it came about and what it means. I'm still intrigued by people that I talk to. I teach racism classes, and I'm intrigued by people who say, well, yeah, it's a good thing that we had the civil rights movement, and see, we had a Black president. So it used to be a problem, but now it's just those people. It isn't just those people. Actually, it's we people.
Do you think that the stigma of going into Wilmington lasted for a long, long time? And I remember we joined Westminster in 2001, and I remember not who, but talking to people. At the time I was working with Habitat, and we were building houses, we were working on houses in the city. And someone said, you wouldn't go into Wilmington. I would be terrified to go into Wilmington. And yet, I do think that I feel hopeful, because I don't feel that as much anymore. So I do think that it's changed a little bit. I think we have a long way to go, but maybe there's a little bit of brightness happening.
Well, and one of the things we know is that the Reach Riverside project that is underway, and now there's hopefully an opportunity for a broadened reconstruction of the east side. There are organizations that have been working, the West End Neighborhood House, a range of other organizations working on providing housing. I think education is fundamental to creating and building a meaningful life. But if you don't have a stable place to live, it's pretty hard to focus on that. And we've been engaging more and more in some of the initiatives with Housing Alliance Delaware and affordable housing and initiatives and programs in the legislature. And so perhaps additional emphasis on housing and education is a useful way to begin to make some changes that won't fix everything, but might make things better a bit at a time in meaningful ways, to begin to get at the root causes and the underlying needs. Any final thoughts before we finish this evening?
Just one final thing. So you were talking about your experience in like after 1968, coming into Wilmington and the DuPont company, and the other gal talked about in 1971, she and her husband moving to Wilmington and wanting to live in the city. I was an insurance agent in Pennsylvania, in the Birmingham, Chadds Ford area from November of 1973 to December of 2006. And many of my customers lived in Pennsylvania and worked in Wilmington. And they were very quick to tell me, many of them were on the transfer circuit, that, you know, the reason that they chose to buy a house where they did, they were told by the people in the departments where they were coming into, oh, you don't want to buy a house in Delaware. You need to go to Pennsylvania because the school districts in Delaware are terrible, and we have a terrible integration problem, and so on and so forth. So believe me, it was still going on. It probably still going on now, but in 2006, I can tell you it was still rampant.
My son and daughter-in-law moved from Delaware to Pennsylvania because of the education system. You know, that was 4 years ago. So the ripple effects, the consequences of the circumstances that were ignited by Martin Luther King's assassination and the quote riot in Wilmington, those ripple effects haven't abated, they've deepened. And the impact is potentially greater today than it was back in 1968. So I think it's incumbent on each of us individually and as a community to do some real soul searching and thinking about who are we called to be and what are we called to do.
And yet Pierre DuPont, who founded Longwood, started the Delaware Auxiliary Fund back in 1922 and 1923, and he built some of the first Black elementary schools here, you know, in the Lewis, you know, Rehoboth area kind of thing. You know, so there was a start, but somehow it all fell apart.
Well, next,
segregated schools, segregated.
Yes, segregated schools, absolutely segregated schools. Yep. In fact, next week, Sandy Reinecker is going to facilitate our program and is going to show an absolutely compelling video that was put together by Newcastle County on the story of the Hockessin Colored School number 107C and the role it played in Brown v. Board of Education, the role it played in Delaware, and the nature of that restored and renovated building as a center for diversity, inclusion, and social justice. And it features some of the students who were at the school in the 1940s. Sonny Knotts is my favorite. He's featured in the film, and it's a powerful, powerful story. I hope you'll all have an opportunity to watch the video and share in that conversation as well.
2 p.m.
So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sue. It was a really, really good video. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sue.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.